Good afternoon, and thank you for your patience in going through a hot and sleepy afternoon and listening to our thoughts on homophobia, torture, and now the torture of women is what I'm going to talk about. For 20 years, as an activist, I have been working for women's rights and been increasingly preoccupied with why women's rights are deprived and why do we have to have this constant struggle to reclaim our rights, which is embellished, it's written about and embedded in our constitution and all the universal declarations that we grew up with, which are enshrined in our constitution. And one of the things that I have found is that perhaps women's rights are taken away precisely because we are female. And because we are female, we are tortured as women and as female. One of the things that I have been working on for 20 years now is the issue of sex trafficking, where the rights of women in prostitution have been contested, and exactly what Ashish has been talking about, that where our bodies become the site of exploitation and the sites of work, and a big debate inside the women's movement about it. As a journalist, I had covered for 14 years all kinds of issues from war, famine, hunger, and conflict. But when I began to work on the issues of sex trafficking and prostitution, what I found was that there was a deliberate exploitation of one human being by another, which I had not seen in any other context. Precisely because the woman was a female, precisely because she had biological parts which could be penetrated. And the deeper that I began to go into this, I began to try to figure out that what was it about a woman's body which attracted so much hatred, so much misogyny. And to my horror, what I found was that one was that women could reproduce, and men wanted to control women's reproduction. And there are three reasons for this. One is, of course, to control production, and reproduction was to control labor. And to control, in the case of caste, as what Deepankar spoke about this morning, was to have women of low caste sexually available to control the production of cheap labor and to also control what the cheap labor did. When it came to women of upper caste and upper classes, it was to control the production of heirs and progeny and the continuation of property. In the context of sex trafficking, what I began to find was that besides this production of cheap labor and production and reproduction, what also happened was exactly what Deepankar spoke about this morning, was the absorbing of pollution. And whereas there were two kinds of categories which were divided: women who were married, and they could be unpolluting, and they could be the producers of heir and progeny. Women in prostitution were sexually available and could absorb the pollution of sin. And in places like Calcutta and Bengal, there's actually a ritual where when the image of the goddess Durga is being made by sculptors, then the sculptor actually goes to the red light area of Sonagachi to collect a fistful of mud from a prostitute's house to put into the image of Durga. Now, this was issue which we were grappling with for a long time, and I was asked this question as I went along working on these issues, that why was mud taken from a prostitute's house to build the image of goddess Durga? And one of the answers that I began to come across was that, again, the idea of sin, sexuality, and absorption of pollution was divided between marriage and non-marriage, between marital sex, non-marital sex, and production and reproduction, and who would control this production and reproduction. So while women in marriage were legitimized with production, women outside of marriage were delegitimized from production. And more recently, there was a judgment passed in India just 4 days ago by a judge called Justice Karnan, who was a Dalit judge. And he passed an order to say that children born out of non-marital sex should actually women who had offspring out of non-marital sex should have alimony just as from their lovers, just as much as children born from marital sex. And this led me to begin to think that, what was it that was being contested because there was a huge outcry of opinion against this judge, and people began to ask that why was this judge trying to either delegitimize non-marital sex or legitimize, because nobody read the judgment fully. And what was absolutely very clear in the judgment was that people did not want children outside marriage to be recognized as legitimate offspring, and alimony or male responsibility to be brought to the forefront legally. So then that took me on to the next part of my conversation today, and this is basically an exploration rather than a presentation, is that why do women's bodies become the contested sites for culture, for production, for absorbing pollution? What is it about our bodies that invites this? And again and again, the same questions which come up is that, is it because we can produce and reproduce? And, and also another thing is that, is it also because most policies, laws, frameworks which are being developed, are they being developed from the point of view of the consumer rather than the consumed? And we've been talking all day towards between dividing lines between the torture and the tortured, between sex and sexuality, between erotica and the body. What are the boundaries of what is sex, which can be, or a body which has a hard boundary or a porous boundary. But in my own work, what I have found is that we have to look at the boundary between the consumer and the consumed. And I will give you three examples when I talk about this boundary between the consumer and the consumed and what it does to the body. On the issue of sex trafficking and prostitution, which I've been working with for about 20 years now, what I have found is that laws and policies are framed around the needs of the consumer rather than the consumed. To give you an example, for the last 20 years, there's a big debate, and there's about legalizing prostitution or not legalizing prostitution, not just in India, but in the whole world, globally, in the US, in the UK, even in Italy, France, Netherlands, Holland, Norway, Sweden. Some of the words which are used, the language around this is the language of whether women should be allowed to be sex workers and whether sex is work. The contested notions here is whether sex should be work, whether prostitution should be legal, and does it allow for the commodification of women's bodies, or does it actually mitigate the harms which are caused to women's bodies by creating some laws and policies around it. And what we have found in the women's movement is that actually the policies and laws were made not on behalf of the consumed, the women in prostitution, but the consumer, because the foundations, the public health officials, the pharmaceutical industry, the ministries of health, the law ministries basically came up with paradigms thinking about what would affect the man the most, who was going to the woman in prostitution inside the red light area. And what they came up with was that most likely what would affect the man the most, who was going to this woman inside the red light area, was perhaps disease. As most of you know, AIDS has been a big pandemic in our country. And when the foundations decided to come and help India, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, what they thought about was that how would they deal with this AIDS pandemic? And they focused on heterosexual sex inside red light areas. And they hired McKinsey, a marketing company, to figure out how to deal with this AIDS pandemic inside red light areas. And they hired 45-year-old doctors who were designing the AIDS management program. And basically, these marketing professionals and the doctors shut their eyes and thought about the demographic of the people who were going and were at risk most to AIDS, and they focused on their counterparts, the 45-year-old man who was buying sex. So the entire design of the program was made to protect male buyers from disease rather than protect the women and girls from the male buyers. and salaries and programs and condoms and entire condom distribution programs were set up, and entire AIDS control departments were set up with the $320 million first provided by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then $210 million supplemented again by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, thrown at a country like India to create this design for condom distribution. And the rights of women and girls were simply thrown down the tube. Health ministry officials were hired, the National AIDS Control Organization program was set up, there was condom distribution means set up through the state AIDS control societies, and pimps and brothel owners were hired as peer educators to distribute these condoms inside red light areas. What this led to finally was that the sex industry got entrenched further, and in the 20 years that I've been working on this issue, what I found was that it has grown by 17 times in India. And also what has happened is that the numbers of those trafficked into prostitution has gone up. The ages of those trafficked has gone down. And the average age of entry into prostitution in India is now between 9 and 13 years old. And there is no debate, or hardly any debate, to challenge the dominant paradigm of AIDS control programs even today. So that is one issue that we have been debating and talking with, and the debate has not just been inside India, it's also been inside United States, because the big foundations who have the big money are actually working inside United States also to promote similar programs. And there it's a minority of women's groups who are actually challenging this big money to take on the notion of what is a woman's body, who is the consumer and who is the consumed, and what is the site of contest over this woman's body. And that takes us to both in the United States, Europe, and India, is that what is the notion of what we are talking about as work, and especially when it is demarcated between men and women, and why is work and sex equated again and again, and who does it actually help when we talk about the consumer and the consumed. Now, this then took us on to another debate when we began to work on this globally, was the role of the pharmaceutical industries. And we began to see that very often the pharmaceutical industries were actually in collaboration with the big public health foundations to actually promote products. And women became the consumers, in this case, rather than the consumed, in the name of whom products were being promoted. And we became the recipients of condoms, which the condom manufacturers would make, and condoms would be thrown all over India or the US or even in many European countries, bought by public health departments, by governments, and thrown into the red light areas, never mind if a woman could use the condom or not. So the line between the consumed and the consumer changed, and actually women were called the consumers, though they had no control over the consumption. And this then takes me to the next thing that happened, was that when we had no control over the consumption, we also became objects for other kinds of things to be marketed. Recently, after the December 16th rape in India, what also happened was that women's movements put up a huge challenge to the increased sexual violence in India and began marching on the streets. And suddenly, political parties realized how big a constituency this was. But not just the political parties. Ernst & Young brought out a report talking about how fantastic a market women were, and how products and advertising campaigns could actually be aimed and promoted with women in mind and take on the whole notion of women's freedom, but the women's freedom to buy. Her choice was limited to what she could buy and what she could not buy. And nobody would look at her absence of choice. So this became the second thing. And finally, of course, the third thing, which, as we worked towards sex trafficking, there were other issues that I began to look at, because in response to this rape, in response to who was a good woman or a bad woman, who was a prostitute or a not prostitute, whether her prostitution was absence of choice or whether it was a real choice, whether her body was her own or not, did she gain control of her sexuality by being in prostitution, or lose control of her sexuality, what also came up was the idea of dress, which Isabel spoke about right at the beginning. That what was, how was our body defined in contemporary politics? And a lot of it was also defined around what we wore. And, the good woman's idea of, whether she wore clothes which covered all her sexual parts. In Iran, of course, it went on to more than sexual parts. It went on to even the notion of covering your hair, and women protesting on the streets to not cover their hair. But similarly, in France, what happened was that women who were Muslim were protesting to have a law which would not tell them not to cover their hair. And again, what we found in the women's movement was that laws were being created on the sides of our bodies, and the choice was not being left to women, either to put on the veil or to take off the veil, either to wear a short skirt or a long skirt, either to gain control of our sexuality, lose control of our sexuality, and how we always were shifting but being controlled between this notion of the consumer and the consumed. And the choice which was only there was to either be the recipient or be consumed. And this finally, actually, in a very recent thing, this led to a debate around breast cancer. I myself am a survivor of breast cancer, and I had to deal with it in terms of information, knowledge, choices that I had to make, whether to have surgery, whether to have a mastectomy, whether to have a double mastectomy, whether to even get my ovaries removed, what is risk prevention, what is beautiful, should I go in for reconstructive surgery? And I made certain choices based on the information I had, but I felt that I was losing control of the choices because a lot of it was imposed again by the medical industry, and though we were always told by doctors it's up to you, so we were told that you can have radical mastectomy, remove both your breasts, you can keep one and have the surgery later. This is the information which is available, and you can choose. Now, the information which was available was always for more surgery, more treatment, more use of pharmaceutical products and medicines, including plastic surgery and the notions of beauty. And recently, as many of you know, Angelina Jolie decided to have radical mastectomy of both her breasts and reconstructive surgery based on the notion that she had based on research that she had a gene which was possibly cancer-causing. I have the same gene, and I was very happy when I read that Angelina Jolie, who's such a beauty icon, whose body is sort of the iconic body that so many people in our contemporary society look at, chose to talk about a disease. The fact that she had disease, because it definitely reduced the stigma around cancer for women. But also, I was a little disheartened when I heard that she has actually chosen to go in for reconstructive surgery, because I felt that she was again succumbing to the cancer industry and to plastic surgeons and going in for very, very conventional notions of beauty and what the body should be. So, I just want to leave you with these thoughts, and I have tried not to present a paper which I had written up, but actually do more kind of an exploration with all of you, because there are such big minds in the room that, rather than giving definitive presentations, I wanted to just open up ideas of what is the body and what are we contending with as feminists and as women's rights activists.